Hey guys, it is August 5th, 2024. I am in the Walmart parking lot sending you guys the very first life group 1 John video. And in this video, I'm not going to talk about a specific chapter. We're not going to start in chapter 1. I really want to lay the groundwork for the chapters to come. And that's this sentiment of context, context, context. Anytime you read the scriptures, or anything at all for that matter, and especially 1 John, you got to know context. And I gave the example to the life group leaders that I had written a contingency letter before I went to Alaska. And in it, I had written to the staff member, I said, prioritize apostolic leadership as a staff. Now, if you read that, and by apostolic, I mean overall direction of where we're headed and vision and planning and all that kind of stuff. And if you read that letter about 50, 100, 2,000 years from now or something, then you might be tempted to think that Dallas only cared about apostolic leadership. But that's not the case. In this context, I'm talking about a contingency plan. I'm talking about, if I'm removed from the equation as the lead pastor, and I'm setting the direction, I'm setting the course, and then you remove me from the equation, then of course the staff now at this point is going to need to prioritize gaining that back in some way of overall direction of where we're headed, of where God wants us to go. And so when Paul talks about that there's been the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, the teachers given for the saints to be equipped for good works and stuff like that, you might be tempted to think that I don't care about the prophetic gifts and the evangelistic gifts and the shepherds and the teachers based on that letter, but that's just not the case. I'm speaking into, if you remove the apostolic leadership, then that's something that we need to prioritize. But again, if you isolate that, if you just say, all right, I'm reading this letter and Dallas says prioritize apostolic leadership. Well, now you might think some things that just aren't true. And this is how bad theology comes about, is that people will take a scripture, they'll isolate it, and they won't know any kind of context. They won't do any kind of cross-referencing. They won't read the whole passage, context within the passage. And they also won't understand background context and what the cultural issues and things were of the day and that sort of thing. And that will lend itself to very poor theology if we're not careful. So the intention of this video is to explain context, context, context for 1 John. And one of the things that you got to know is that John likely here is trying to directly refute a movement called Gnosticism. All right, Gnosticism really grew in this time frame. So John is likely 75, 80 at least years old at this time. He's the last of the 12 apostles remaining by far. The others have been burned alive, sent to a cross. They've been killed. In fact, John himself had an attempted execution, wasn't executed, and so he was shipped off to an island. And from that island, he writes this letter, and he understands that there's a growing sense of this movement called Gnosticism. And it doesn't matter that the world is giving into this movement. It matters that the Christians themselves are starting to adopt some of these Gnostic tenets. And so essentially, there are three that I want to talk through with you today. So if you have a pen and you want to write these down, I think that could be important as you continue reading. Number one is the Gnostics believed that essentially everything ended with knowledge. It didn't really matter your character or what you did. It just mattered what you knew. The idea of knowledge is power, so to speak. And so consequently, if you read something like 1 John 2:4, where it says, those who say that they know him but don't keep his commands is a liar. Well, if you don't understand context, if you don't understand that he's refuting this Gnostic belief, then you could read that, you could isolate that verse and now start to have a legalistic, works-based theology. But if you know John and you know the context, if you know what he's speaking into, then, and if you just zoom out just a little bit further, you'll see that he's saying that keeping the commands is evidence that you actually do in fact know him. And that's a major difference, isn't it? He's speaking to this Gnostic belief to say, look, you think you really know him, you think you have a relationship with him just because you know about him. But what he's saying is, if you really just know him like in your bones, then there will be evidence for the fact that you know him. And so he's refuting this widely held Gnostic belief that knowledge is all you need. And that's the first one. The second one is that there's a hierarchy of individuals in this time frame. He's really trying to squash this Gnostic belief that there's a hierarchy of individuals. In fact, when he starts the letter, I mean, he just pours it out there from the start. He's like, man, I've got credibility. I saw and touched the resurrected Jesus and everything. And yet, even though I know him in a way that maybe you haven't, and maybe you didn't because you weren't around at that time, I want to share this thing with you. In fact, it'll bring me so much joy. In fact, my joy will be complete in sharing this with you and having fellowship with you. In fact, that's another thing, that because there was a hierarchy of individuals based on what you knew, then if you knew less, then you were kind of worthless. And so they wouldn't associate, they wouldn't tie themselves, they wouldn't fellowship with people who didn't know as much as them. And so here John is this last remaining apostle, and he goes, man, you know what would make my joy complete is if you shared in everything that I knew. If you just fellowshipped with me, that would make my joy complete. Think about the humility. Think about the extending of the hand. Think about the temptation to start to think that you're a little bit better than everybody because you actually touched the resurrected Jesus. And yet he squashes that from the very start, and he goes, look, I want to have fellowship with you. That's what's actually going to bring me joy, is that, you know, when I am abiding in Jesus and now you're fellowshipping in that and you're abiding in Jesus, that's what's going to make my joy complete. And in fact, if you go to John 15, I'd encourage you to do this during the study. Go to John chapter 15, and Jesus himself says something very similar. He says something about, I'm in the Father, and if you abide in me, you have fellowship with me and you have fellowship with the Father. And he says, if you just remain in my love, then my joy will be made complete. Jesus says that himself in John chapter 15. And so given that this is the same writer in the book of John and in 1 John, likely, you see that he took that on from Jesus. Jesus is his model. Jesus is his everything. And so now he's just mimicking what Jesus himself said in John 15. He says, make my joy complete by having fellowship and knowing the true Jesus and knowing who he is. And so that takes us to the third widely held Gnostic belief of the time, which was that Jesus could not be the Son of God because good cannot exist in the same realm as sin. God himself, who is good, could not exist on earth and in flesh because he could not coexist with sin in the same environment. And John, especially after the first couple of chapters, he really dispels this notion with the idea of love. He very clearly states early on that yes, there is no darkness in Jesus. He is light. That's who he is. But he also is love. And it's fact on the basis of love that he does put on flesh. That, you know, John 3:16, that famous verse, for God so loved the world. What compelled him? What was the motivator? It was love was the motivator. Love is what made the engine run. Love is what made him empty the cupboard on our behalf, because he loves us so much. That's the reason why he put on flesh. That's the reason why he came to dwell with us, so that we could know him, so that we could truly know him, so that we could actually have a relationship with him. It's on the basis of love. It's on the basis of love, parents, that no matter how wild and crazy your kids act, that you dive in, that you relationally connect, that you extend a hand, that you love them, that you pour out. See, love gives. Love pours out. And that's the point that John is trying to make here to the Gnostics. He's like, are you kidding me? You know, you believe that there has to be some separation here? It's like, man, God's the one who shares the story in Luke about the parables of the lost sheep and the son who, you know, I mean, he can't even work up his speech before the father just runs and embraces him, you know, all smelly and wasted everything, squandered all the things and stuff like that. And the Father is just compelled by love to run to him. And that's the point that John is trying to make here, is that of course he can exist into the realm of humans and into flesh and into the world of sin around him. He is not sin, but he takes on sin on our behalf. And that's the important thing to recognize from this. So he's speaking into three things here that Gnostics believed. Number one, that knowledge is really all you need. Character doesn't matter. In fact, you'll see time and time again, he talks about verb form of like walking with him to promote the idea that what you do matters. It's evidence of what's really in there. And then the second one is that there's a hierarchy of individuals. He just squashes that notion. I mean, how many times, somebody count it out, let me know when you read through 1 John, how many times does John say whoever? I mean, this is an open invitation to anyone. I mean, Jesus is the great equalizer. Everything, the ground is level at the foot of the cross, and anybody is welcome. And John is trying to really let us know that with this letter. And then the last one being that God could not exist on the earth because there's sin on the earth, and he could not sort of intermingle or weave himself in the realm of sin. But it's the basis of love that then compels him to meet us right where we are. And so we've got to understand that. And so as you wrestle through the letter of 1 John, man, just really consider context, really consider questions, really consider maybe you've had some realm of Gnostic belief. I mean, I think that it's very common to lean that direction. Like, there is some kind of separation, that God is far above me, and there is this separation, and he's just got like a clipboard, and he's taking notes, and he's checking in on my progress and stuff like that, and not feeling like he's actually dwelling with me and extending a hand to me and really loves me and has poured out for me. And so all those things are really important. Context as you read through 1 John. Please let me know if you have any questions. I will send out chapter by chapter here to come. If you guys have any questions, reach out to your life group leader, reach out to me. Look at other sources too. Don't just take my word for it. Go and research people who are much smarter and more well-read and more scholarly than I am. They may have a different take on some different things. And so look into that. Understand more deeply context as you continue in your reading of 1 John. And look forward to talking to you guys soon. See ya.